Okay, so today we're diving into a pretty fundamental concept in ethics, something called ethical supervenience.
Yeah, supervenience. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the idea itself is pretty intuitive, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
It's basically this idea that, like when we make ethical judgments,
Right.
those judgments aren't just floating out there in some kind of ethical void.
Yeah, there's got to be something connecting them, right?
Exactly. There's got to be a connection to other kinds of facts, other properties about the things we're judging.
Yeah, it's like if we say something is morally wrong, there has to be a reason why.
Right. Like some underlying facts that make it wrong.
It can't just be wrong because, well, just because. Right.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting, the idea behind ethical supervenience is that if all those other facts, all those base properties stay the same,
Right.
then the ethical judgment should stay the same too.
It can't just magically flip to being right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine two scenarios that are identical in every single way, except for the ethical judgment we make about them. That would be super weird, right? It just wouldn't make sense.
No, it totally wouldn't. And actually, there's this great example in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that really brings this home.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the example of a bank manager embezzling money. So, picture this, right? We know every single detail about the case. We know the exact amount stolen, how the manager pulled it off, all the consequences, the manager's motivations, everything.
A super detailed picture.
Yeah, every little naturalistic fact you can think of. And now imagine a second bank manager doing the exact same thing in the exact same circumstances.
Okay.
And ethical supervenience basically says that it would be totally absurd to say that the first manager's actions were wrong,
Right.
but the second manager's actions were okay.
Yeah, that just wouldn't fly.
Yeah.
How could they be different ethically if every other aspect of the situation is identical?
Exactly. It just seems like a really, really strong intuition,
It does. It does. And, a lot of philosophers actually think that this connection, this ethical supervenience, it's not just limited to these isolated cases.
Yeah.
They argue that there's this kind of broad, necessary connection between ethical properties and all these other kinds of properties.
Interesting. Like a more general principle at work.
Right. Like the Stanford Encyclopedia, they call it the initial thesis, which basically says that whenever there's an ethical difference between two possible scenarios, actions, whatever, there has to be some naturalistic difference between them as well.
Okay, I see. So we're not just talking about one-off cases here.
Nope. We're talking about a fundamental connection between the ethical realm and all the other stuff that makes up the world.
Wow, that's pretty huge.
It is. And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today, exploring this whole concept of ethical supervenience. We'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia as our guide.
Right, the trusty Stanford Encyclopedia.
It really lays out the whole terrain.
Right.
What does supervenience actually mean? Why do philosophers care about it so much?
Right.
And it even gets into some of the really tricky, even perplexing questions that this idea raises.
Definitely not a simple concept.
Not at all.
But we're going to try to break it down and make it clear for everyone.
Exactly. And I think, one of the things we'll be focusing on is, well, what are these base properties we keep talking about? What are the specific types of properties that might actually be the foundation for ethical properties?
Yeah, that's a good question. What does ethics actually depend on? And is it just a kind of correlation, or is there something deeper going on, like a really, really strong necessary connection?
And then there's the kind of the meta question, right? Is this all about reality itself, about the way the world actually is? Or is it more about how we think about ethics, how we make judgments?
Ooh, that's getting deep.
I know, right?
But that's why we're here.
For sure. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. What does this whole ethical supervenience thing actually mean? What are we talking about when we use this term?
Yeah, let's break it down.
Okay, so at its core, ethical supervenience is about a relationship between two sets of properties.
Okay.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia, they use some specific terms here, like supervening properties.
Supervening.
Yeah, and those are the ethical properties themselves. Things like goodness, rightness, virtue, those kinds of concepts.
Right, the ethical stuff.
Exactly. And then you have the what they call subvening or base properties.
Okay.
And these are the properties that the ethical properties actually depend on.
Ah, okay, I see. So it's like the base properties are the foundation.
Exactly.
And the ethical properties are built on top of that foundation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Think of the base properties as the underlying facts of the situation.
Right.
And the ethical properties are the evaluative layer that comes from those facts. So if the facts don't change, the ethical evaluation shouldn't change either.
Got it. And the encyclopedia actually lays out some specific logical features that are usually associated with supervenience relations.
Oh, right, the technical stuff.
Yeah, it sounds a bit technical, but it's actually pretty straightforward.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so the first one is called reflexivity.
Reflexivity.
Yeah, and it basically means that, well, everything supervenes on itself.
Okay.
So in the case of ethical properties, it means they can't vary without ethical properties varying.
Yeah, it kind of seems obvious.
Yeah, it's like saying A equals A.
Right, like it's just a matter of identity.
But even though it seems obvious, it's still a necessary piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's got to be there for the whole thing to make sense logically.
Exactly. Then there's the second one called transitivity.
Transitivity. Ooh, now we're getting fancy.
I know, right? But it's not that bad.
Right, lay it on me.
So basically, transitivity means that if ethical properties supervene on one set of properties, and those properties themselves supervene on another set of properties,
Okay, I'm following so far.
then the ethical properties also supervene on that second set.
So it's like a chain reaction.
Yeah, exactly. Like, let's say the moral permissibility of an action depends on the agent's intentions.
Okay.
And those intentions, they depend on some underlying psychological states.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Then, because of transitivity, the moral permissibility ultimately depends on those psychological states, too.
So it's like if A depends on B and B depends on C.
Then A also depends on C.
Got it. Makes sense.
Right. And then there's a third one, non-symmetry.
Non-symmetry.
And this is where it gets interesting because it shows us that the dependence goes one way but not the other.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So remember the bank manager example?
Yeah.
The moral wrongness of the embezzlement supervenes on all those naturalistic facts.
Right, the details of the case.
But those facts, they don't depend on our moral judgment.
So the amount stolen, the method, all that stuff, it doesn't change just because we say it's wrong.
Exactly. The facts are what they are, regardless of our evaluation.
That's interesting. It's like the ethical judgment follows from the facts, but the facts don't follow from the judgment.
Right. And that's a really important point, I think, because it shows us that ethical supervenience is descriptive.
Descriptive.
Yeah, it's telling us how things are.
Not how they ought to be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's describing this pattern of covariation between ethical properties and these base properties.
It's saying, look, this is how things are connected, but it doesn't explain why.
Right. That's a whole other philosophical can of worms.
Yeah, for sure. Like there are other concepts out there, like grounding, that try to explain this dependence.
Right. But that's not what supervenience is about.
No, it's just about describing the pattern.
Okay, so we've got the basics down now. We know ethical properties supervene on some other set of properties, and we've got a handle on the logical structure of this relationship.
Right. But I think the next big question is, what are these base properties? What are the specific things that ethics might actually supervene on?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? What is it that makes something good or bad, right or wrong?
Yeah, and this is where things get a little more complex, a little more debated.
As if things weren't complex enough already.
Right. But this is philosophy. It's supposed to be complex.
That's true. So where do we even begin with this question?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia, they start with this idea that ethics might supervene on the natural properties.
The natural properties. Okay, that makes sense. What's natural is what exists in the world, right?
Yeah, that's the general idea. But the thing is, even the definition of natural is debated in philosophy.
Oh, come on, really? We can't even agree on what's natural.
Nope. What one philosopher considers natural, another might completely reject.
So how are we supposed to figure out what ethics supervenes on if we can't even agree on what natural means?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess.
That's putting it mildly.
But it's important to acknowledge that ambiguity because it opens the door to some pretty interesting counterexamples.
The counterexamples.
Yeah, what if we imagine scenarios involving, let's say, supernatural entities or forces, even if we don't actually believe in them?
Okay, going a bit sci-fi here.
Right, but just bear with me. Could there be two scenarios that are identical in all their natural properties?
Okay.
But differ ethically because of some supernatural intervention or something?
That's a good question. Like, does the natural realm encompass everything that matters for ethics?
Right. And some philosophers have actually used these kinds of thought experiments to argue that ethics might not supervene solely on the natural.
Interesting. So maybe we need to broaden our horizons a bit when thinking about these base properties.
Yeah, maybe. And that brings us to another proposal that's discussed in the encyclopedia. It's the idea that ethics might supervene on the non-ethical properties.
Non-ethical. Okay, so if it's not natural, maybe it's just well, everything else.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. Like, for any ethical difference to exist, there has to be some corresponding difference in the non-ethical facts, whether those facts are natural or not.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm guessing there are some issues with this view too, right?
Yeah, there are. One problem is that it runs into trouble with certain reductive ethical theories.
Reductive.
Yeah, theories that try to reduce ethical concepts to something more basic. Like, let's say you have a theory that says goodness is just identical to pleasure.
Okay, so good equals pleasure.
Right. Now, if two possible worlds could differ solely in the amount of pleasure they contain,
Okay.
then they would differ ethically without any non-ethical difference, because pleasure itself would be an ethical property.
Ah, so this view kind of collapses on itself.
Yeah, exactly. And this raises the question of whether these kinds of reductive accounts should be rejected, precisely because they seem to violate this principle of supervenience on the non-ethical.
Okay, so figuring out these base properties is definitely trickier than it seems at first.
It really is. And, there's always the temptation to just say, well, ethics supervenes on all properties.
Okay, so basically giving up and saying it depends on everything.
Yeah, but the encyclopedia points out that this kind of claim is, well, it's a bit trivial.
Trivial.
Yeah, it doesn't really tell us anything interesting. Like,
Right.
Sure, if there's an ethical difference, then there's got to be some difference somewhere.
But that's just stating the obvious.
Exactly. It doesn't help us understand the nature of the dependence or why it exists.
Okay, so we need to be more specific.
Absolutely, yeah. And one interesting perspective that the encyclopedia discusses is, it's from Frank Jackson.
Frank Jackson, the philosopher.
Yeah, and he argues that evaluative predicates, the words we use to express ethical judgments, they supervene on descriptive predicates.
Descriptive predicate. So, if we can describe two situations using language that doesn't have any ethical terms in it, and those descriptions are identical,
Right.
then those situations must also be ethically identical.
Exactly. So the idea is that ethics is grounded in our capacity to describe the world.
Interesting. So, in a way, it's saying that if we can't find a descriptive difference between two scenarios, then there can't be an ethical difference either.
Precisely. But, of course, there are some potential issues with this view as well.
There are always issues, aren't there?
Well, that's philosophy for you. But yeah, like the encyclopedia points out, one problem is whether our descriptive language is always, rich enough.
Rich enough.
Yeah, can it really capture all the nuances that might be ethically relevant?
So maybe our language is just too limited to describe everything that matters for ethics.
Maybe. And there's also the question of whether the distinction between description and evaluation is always so clear-cut.
Right. Is it all about the words themselves, or is there something more going on, like how we use those words in different contexts?
Exactly. So even this view, while interesting, it's not without its challenges.
Okay, so we've looked at the natural properties, non-ethical properties, descriptive properties, and we're still no closer to a definitive answer.
Yeah, it's tough. And because of all these challenges, philosophers have come up with a bunch of other proposals.
Oh boy, more
A
proposals.
whole bunch. Some define the base properties as this, disjunctive class of non-ethical or descriptive properties.
Okay, so basically combining those two.
Yeah, kind of. And others focus on the properties that even ethical non-naturalists would agree are non-ethical.
So trying to find common ground.
Exactly. And then there's this whole other distinction between repeatable properties, those that can be instantiated in multiple individuals.
Like being tall or being red.
Yeah, exactly. And non-repeatable properties, like, let's say, being identical to Socrates.
Which only one person can have.
Right. And most philosophers think ethical properties probably supervene on repeatable properties.
Because, well, moral judgments tend to be general.
Right. We usually say things like, lying is wrong.
Not lying in this specific instance is wrong.
Exactly. But even with all these proposals...
No clear winner yet.
Not really. The encyclopedia basically says that we're still figuring out what ethics supervenes on.
Yeah.
It's a very active area of research.
Okay, so we're not going to get a definitive answer today.
I don't think so.
But that's all right. It's still fascinating to explore.
Absolutely. And, even though we haven't nailed down the what, we can still talk about the how. What's the structure of this supervenience relation? Are we talking about individual entities or whole possible worlds?
Ooh, that's an interesting distinction.
Right. And the encyclopedia actually makes that distinction between global and individual supervenience.
Okay, so let's start with global. What's that all about?
Well, global supervenience focuses on entire possible worlds. The idea is that if two possible worlds have the exact same pattern of base properties,
Everything's the same.
across all their parts, then they also have to have the same pattern of ethical properties.
So it's like comparing two complete descriptions of reality, and if the non-ethical facts are identical everywhere.
Then the ethical facts have to be identical everywhere too.
Okay, that's a pretty grand claim.
It is. But then there's individual supervenience, which zooms in on, specific entities and their properties within a particular world.
So not whole universes anymore, just individual things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia distinguishes between two main forms here.
Yeah.
Weak and strong individual supervenience.
Weak and strong. Sounds intriguing. What's the difference?
Well, weak individual supervenience says that if an entity, let's call it X,
Okay.
if X has an ethical property, let's say F,
Mm-hmm.
then there must be at least one base property, G, that X also has,
Okay.
such that everything in this particular world that also has G also has F.
So it's all about correlations within our world.
Exactly. Like, let's say there's this specific act of generosity, and we say it's good.
Okay.
Weak supervenience implies that there's some underlying property of that act, maybe it alleviated suffering,
Right.
and any other act in our world that also alleviates suffering in the same way
Would also have to be good.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about strong individual supervenience? How is that different?
Well, with strong supervenience, we're not just talking about correlations that happen to hold in our world.
Uh-huh.
We're talking about a necessary connection that holds across all possible worlds.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's a much stronger claim.
Much stronger. It says that if X has F, then there's some G that X also has.
Okay.
Such that necessarily, and I mean necessarily in every conceivable world,
Uh-huh.
everything that has G also has F.
So it doesn't matter what the world is like.
Doesn't matter.
If something has that base property, it automatically has the ethical property.
Yeah, it's unbreakable. The encyclopedia actually uses a great example to illustrate this difference. They talk about utilitarianism versus Kantian ethics.
Okay, I'm familiar with those.
So weak supervenience would be fine with the idea that in some worlds, rightness always means maximizing happiness, like the utilitarians say.
Right.
But in other worlds, rightness always means following Kant's categorical imperative.
So different worlds, different ethical rules.
Exactly. But strong supervenience would say, no way.
Can't have that.
Nope. The link between the base property and the ethical property, it's got to be the same everywhere.
Invariant across all worlds.
Yeah, exactly. And generally, philosophers agree that strong individual supervenience implies both global supervenience and weak individual supervenience.
Makes sense. It's the strongest of the three.
Right. But whether global supervenience implies strong individual supervenience...
That's still up for debate.
Yeah, that's a bit of a metaphysical head-scratcher.
Okay, so we've got weak, strong, and global. Are there any other types of supervenience we need to know about?
Well, there's also this idea of strong intuitive supervenience.
Strong and intuitive.
It's basically the idea that if you have two possible entities, and they're exactly alike in all their base properties... They got to be alike in all their ethical properties, too.
So same foundation, same ethical evaluation.
Right. And the encyclopedia notes that when we're talking about metaphysical possibility...
Yeah, metaphysical possibility. So, like, what's possible in terms of the way reality could be?
Exactly.
So,
This strong intuitive principle, it ends up being equivalent to strong individual supervenience.
okay, so they're basically the same thing in that context.
Yeah, basically. But when we start talking about different types of possibility, like conceptual possibility...
Conceptual possibility. So, like, what we can conceive of without contradiction.
Exactly. Then these distinctions can become really important.
Oh, I see. So the type of possibility we're talking about can actually affect the way we understand supervenience.
Yeah, it can make a big difference. And that leads us nicely into our next topic, the modal strength of ethical supervenience.
Modal strength.
Which basically means how strong is the must in ethical supervenience.
Okay, I like that. Because we've been throwing around words like necessary and possible a lot.
Yeah, we got to be careful with those words.
They're slippery.
And because they have different meanings depending on the context. Like the encyclopedia reminds us that necessity comes in different flavors.
Flavors of necessity, that's a new one.
Right, so there's logical necessity, which is like the strongest kind.
The strongest.
Yeah, it's basically truth based on the structure of logic itself.
Like if A equals A.
Exactly. You can't deny that without contradicting yourself.
Right, it's rock solid.
Then there's conceptual necessity, which is sometimes called analyticity.
Analyticity.
And this is where the truth comes from, the meanings of the concepts involved.
So, like, all bachelors are unmarried men.
Yeah, that's a classic example. It's true by definition.
Right. You can't be a bachelor and be married.
Exactly. Then we have gnomic necessity, which is about the laws of nature.
Ah, so like nothing can travel faster than light.
Yeah, or at least nothing with mass can travel faster than light in a vacuum.
Important clarification.
It's all about the physics, right?
Right. So logical is about pure logic, conceptual is about definitions, and gnomic is about the laws of nature.
Yep. And then there's metaphysical necessity, which is a bit more, well, metaphysical.
As the name suggests.
Right. It's about what's fundamentally true about reality itself, like what has to be the case no matter what.
So like water is HO.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah.
It's not just a contingent fact about our world. It's true in every possible world.
Oh, okay. So metaphysical necessity is about those truths that hold across all possible worlds.
Exactly. And then finally, there's this more debated category, normative necessity.
Normative necessity.
Yeah, and this one relates to, well, normative principles, ethical principles.
So like the idea that causing pain for no reason is wrong?
Yeah, exactly. Like, is that just a matter of opinion, or is there some kind of necessity to it?
That's a tough one.
It is. And the encyclopedia actually points out that philosophers are still debating the status and even the distinctness of these different types of necessity.
So it's not even clear if they're all actually different.
Yeah, some people think they might collapse into each other, or that some of them don't even really exist.
Oh boy, more philosophical debates.
I know, right? But even if we just accept these distinctions for now,
Okay, let's assume they're all legit.
we can ask this really crucial question. What kind of must is at work in ethical supervenience?
Ah, yeah, that's the key question. Is it logical, conceptual, metaphysical, or something else entirely?
And the answer to that question has huge implications for how we understand the nature and the force of ethical supervenience.
So we've talked about what ethics might supervene on, the different structural forms of supervenience,
Okay.
and now the different strengths of necessity that might be involved.
Right. And to make things even more fun, the encyclopedia introduces another really interesting distinction.
Oh boy, hit me with it.
They call it ontological versus ascriptive supervenience.
Okay, ontological versus ascriptive. I'm all ears.
So ontological supervenience, which is what we've been mostly focusing on so far,
Right.
it's about a relationship between ethical properties and other properties in the world.
So it's a claim about how things actually are.
Exactly. But ascriptive supervenience, which was developed by a philosopher named James Clegg,
James Clegg, okay.
it shifts the focus to our ethical judgments.
So not about the world itself, but about how we judge things.
Right. The basic idea is that if someone treats two scenarios as identical in all their base properties.
So no difference in the underlying facts. But they make different ethical judgments about those scenarios.
Then they're making a mistake.
A mistake. So it's not just that they have different opinions, it's like they're actually doing something wrong.
Exactly. It's like a violation of some kind of rational constraint on our judgments.
Okay, that's a pretty strong claim.
It is.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that the encyclopedia points out that this mistake in ascriptive supervenience,
Yeah.
it can be understood in a bunch of different ways.
Oh, so there's not just one type of mistake.
Nope. Like it could be an alethic mistake.
Alethic. Sounds fancy.
It just means that at least one of the judgments is asserting something false.
Oh, okay, so it's like one of them is just plain wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it could also be an epistemic mistake.
Epistemic, that's about knowledge, right?
Yep. So an epistemic mistake would be that at least one of the judgments lacks sufficient justification.
So they might both be true, but the person doesn't have good enough reasons to believe one of them.
Right. Or it could be a conceptual mistake.
Conceptual, so something to do with the meanings of the words.
Exactly. Like maybe the inconsistent judgments are violating the very meanings of our ethical terms.
So they're using the words wrong.
Yeah, kind of. And here's the really interesting part. It could even be an ethical mistake.
An ethical mistake. Wait, so making inconsistent judgments could itself be morally wrong?
That's the idea. Like, maybe there's something inherently wrong with being inconsistent in our ethical evaluations.
That's pretty meta.
It is. And this whole idea of ascriptive supervenience, it's actually quite significant because it suggests that you can believe in ethical supervenience, this requirement for consistency,
Right.
without necessarily believing in objective ethical properties.
So you don't have to think there's like some kind of moral truth out there in the world.
Exactly. You could just say the consistency in our judgments is important for its own sake.
Okay, that's a really interesting distinction. And the encyclopedia mentions that someone who accepts that strong, intuitive ontological supervenience.
The one about identical entities having to be ethically identical.
Right. that person would probably also accept ascriptive supervenience.
With the alethic understanding of the mistake.
So they'd say that making inconsistent judgments is just plain wrong.
Yep. And this is actually pretty cool because it suggests that ascriptive supervenience, it could be something that philosophers from very different perspectives could agree on.
Like, even if they disagree about the ultimate nature of ethics, they might still agree that we need to be consistent in our judgments.
Exactly. So it could be a point of convergence even in the midst of all these other debates.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about different types of supervenience,
Different base properties.
modal strength,
Ontological versus ascriptive.
and now I think the question is, why should we even believe in any of this?
Yeah.
What are the arguments for ethical supervenience?
Right. Like, why should we care about this whole thing? And the encyclopedia points out that sometimes philosophers just seem to accept some form of ethical supervenience as, like, a background assumption.
Like, it's so obvious it doesn't need to be argued for.
Yeah, maybe because it has this really strong intuitive appeal, like we talked about earlier.
Right. It just seems weird to have ethical differences without any other differences.
Exactly. But the encyclopedia also makes this important point. There's not just one single thesis of ethical supervenience.
Ah, so the arguments might differ depending on which version we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. The reasons for believing in weak supervenience might be different from the reasons for believing in strong supervenience.
Okay, so we need to be careful about generalizing.
Absolutely. But the encyclopedia does outline a kind of general argumentative strategy.
Okay, what's a strategy?
It usually involves two main parts. The first is generalizing from specific cases, like that bank manager example.
Ah, so we start with these concrete examples where the intuition is really strong.
Exactly. Like we see this necessary connection in those cases. And we say, well, maybe this suggests a more general principle at work.
That maybe ethical differences always require some underlying non-ethical difference.
Exactly. And this kind of reasoning, it supports those broad supervenience theses, like the initial one we talked about earlier.
Okay, so that's one part of the strategy. What's the second part?
The second part draws on this idea from Henry Sidgwick,
Henry Sidgwick, the utilitarian philosopher.
the one and only. And he basically argued that while we might accept certain brute contingencies in the physical world,
Brute contingency.
yeah, like things just happening to be a certain way without any deeper explanation,
Okay.
we can't accept that kind of unexplained variation in the ethical realm.
Ah, so there's got to be a reason for ethical differences.
Right. Ethical facts can't just be arbitrary. They got to be grounded in something.
So ethical supervenience from this perspective,
Uh-huh.
it's basically saying that ethics isn't just random.
Yeah, it's tethered to something more fundamental.
Okay, I like that.
Right.
And it seems like these two parts of